Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. Today's video is all about graphic novels. I'm going to be recommending a lot of places that I think are good to start depending on your genre preferences and the things that you generally like to read, but also for those of you who are seasoned graphic novel readers, hopefully you'll find some new things that maybe you didn't know about that you may want to check out. Regardless of the genre that you like to read or the age category that you like to read from, there's probably a graphic novel out there that you would be a fan of. So in today's video, I'm going to be sharing a range of recommendations of graphic novels that I really love that go all the way from middle grade up to adult. We have some science fiction, some fantasy, some horror, some nonfiction, and memoirs. There's a lot of great options and I think something for everybody. But before I get into all of those recommendations, I want to tell you about an upcoming graphic novel that is launching on Kickstarter from the sponsor of today's video. I am so excited to introduce you guys to the work of PETA Comics. They're an up-and-coming indie comics company that has had some cool projects come out through Kickstarter in the past, and today they're launching a project that I'm really excited about. This is Olaju: The Edge of Origins. When they had originally reached out to me via email, they sent me an early copy of issue 1 of what's going to become this graphic novel bind-up, so I read it and took a look at it and I was like, yes, this is very cool. Let's definitely work together. This is a project that I want to support, so I'm really excited to bring it to all of you, and I hope you'll use the link in the video description down below to check out the project, check out the graphic novel that they're doing. Particularly if you are looking for an easy way to diversify your reading, diversify your bookshelves, maybe meet some of those last-minute Goodreads goals before the end of the year, this could be a great way to do it. The author of the comic is from West Africa, and this story is inspired by West African mythology. The creator said it is born out of the mythology about the Nkworo Osisi of the Igbo-speaking people of West Africa. It was said that they existed long ago and they are earth builders, so that's what they've coined this story from. I can tell you from the little bit that I've had the privilege of reading that the story is really interesting. The artwork, though, is stunning. So beautiful. I'm going to show you some images here from the comic so you can get a sense of the art style. I just think it is absolutely breathtaking, and it's a cool way to learn a little bit more about West African mythology. So like really there's no downside here. You should definitely go and check out this Kickstarter. If you want to just grab your copy of the graphic novel, you can do that, but they also have merch options. So if that is of interest to you, they've got hoodies, they've got t-shirts, they've got collectible figurines that are inspired by the project. I just think this is really awesome. I know we've got all these really huge comics companies, but indie comics are so important. And so if you want to go and support an indie comics creator that is using Kickstarter as a way to get these stories out into the world, support a West African author, learn a little bit more about mythology that you may not be super familiar with, and get to see these beautiful, beautiful images, you should definitely use that link to go check out the Kickstarter. And if you do pick up a copy of the graphic novel, let me know in the comments down below. They were kind enough to offer to send me a finished copy so that I can read the entire thing once it's finished, because I just got to read issue 1, which just whet my appetite for knowing more about the story. So I hope to discuss this more with all of you in the future if you also grab it. Thank you so much to Peter for sponsoring this video, and I hope you all will go and support the project that they're working on. With that said, let's go ahead and dive into my graphic novel and some comics recommendations for people who maybe don't know where to start or people who are seasoned readers and just want something new to try. I'm going to start with some recommendations for middle grade and YA graphic novels that I think are fantastic. These are ones that I've read and loved enough that I've kept copies on my shelves, and if you haven't read them yet, you should definitely check them out. First up, if you want something that is adorable and whimsical and fantastical that will just make your heart really warm, you might want to try The Tea Dragon Society by Katie O'Neill. There are, I want to say at least three books in this series now, and oh my gosh, it's so cute and soft. They're these little tea dragons. They are dragons that grow tea leaves out of the top of their heads, and they're just these really soft, sweet, character-driven stories about friendship and love and diversity, and they're so inclusive, and they just make my heart really happy. So if you haven't checked these out, what are you doing? If you need something that will put a smile on your face and you don't mind something that is not at all plot driven, highly recommend checking out the Tea Dragon Society. A middle grade graphic novel that's been getting a lot of buzz lately because it was banned in Texas and is phenomenal, you all should definitely go read it, is New Kid by Jerry Craft. I don't know if it was banned or was on a list of possibly being banned, but yeah. Why banned? Honestly, I don't know. I think this is fantastic. It follows a young black boy who is starting middle school at a new school that is predominantly white, and he's nervous about it and isn't sure how that's gonna go. And so this is an interesting book because while it does have moments in it that are shedding light on the kinds of microaggressions that kids in this situation might face, it deals with it in a more lighthearted sort of way, and a lot of the story is about him developing friendships and learning to be comfortable in this new school and finding things he has in common with other kids, but it does also kind of highlight some of the not so great things that he faces. But I really loved this. I flew through it. I think it's fantastic. And you know, some people like to go read banned books, so here's a good one for your end of year list. The other two graphic novels I have are kind of in that crossover between middle grade and YA. So I guess you could say like upper middle grade, lower YA. This is where your target audience is going to be like 12 to 13, although certainly kids older and younger could read it as well. The first one is The Magic Fish by Trung Le Nguyen. I love this. I think it's beautiful. It made me cry, and if you know me, you know that that is a rarity. There are not that many books that make me cry every year. I don't like cry at the drop of a hat. But this is the story of a boy who has grown up in the United States, but his parents were refugees from Vietnam. His mom is still learning English, but one thing that they do together is they read fairy tales. So part of this is the fairy tales that he and his mom kind of read together. But what's beautiful about it is it shows his life and also shows him trying to figure out how to come out as gay to his mom, and ultimately he ends up kind of using these fairy tales. I just love this. I thought it was beautiful. I loved the art style and I loved the message, and it was really cute and really sweet, and I would highly recommend checking it out. My next recommendation is an indie YA graphic comic that I really liked. These are a little bit hard to find, although I did find a couple of indie bookstores that carry them, so I will have a link in the video description down below if you want to find these. And I hope we get more issues because there's so much more story to be told. But this is issue 1 of The Search for Sadiqa, story by Greg Burnham. What I think is really interesting about this and other comics by this author is that they take real moments in African American history and then put a speculative spin on them. So this is set in the 1920s, and it follows a 12 or 13-year-old black girl who had grown up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And if you aren't familiar with it, Tulsa, Oklahoma had at one point a very prosperous black community. The Greenwood district had a lot of very prosperous black businesses. They had a thriving community. But then in 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre took place. That was extreme violence. It devastated this community. A lot of people died. And this series follows a girl who had grown up in that community and ends up escaping that violence while learning about a magical legacy that her family has, and she goes on the search for a magical location. So it's dealing with real world history, but putting a magical twist on it. And this isn't the only series that he's done this with, of taking real black history and then turning it into something interesting and speculative for a comic series. So I would definitely recommend going and checking that out. I think he has one about the Tuskegee Airmen as well, which looks very, very cool. My last recommendation in this category is a kind of upper middle grade, lower YA sci-fi graphic novel that was a lot of fun. This is Pepper Page Saves the Universe. It is a sci-fi superhero origin story following this orphaned girl named Pepper Page. And I won't, I mean, it's quick, so I won't spoil what happens, but it's her origin story to ultimately becoming a superhero. And it was a lot of fun. It was funny. It deals with bullying and finding yourself and becoming who you are, and I loved it. Definitely would recommend checking it out. The next category of recommendations is nonfiction. I actually love a nonfiction graphic novel. I think especially if nonfiction isn't something you pick up all the time or you feel intimidated by it, a nonfiction graphic novel can be a really fantastic option. I think it makes it more easily accessible, more digestible because you have the images going along with the text, but it's also telling you about real things, real history. And in this case, the 3 recommendations I have for you are all memoirs, so graphic memoirs, which I just think is so good. Graphic memoirs work really well. 2 of these I'm sure you've probably seen before, but if you haven't read them yet, this is your note of encouragement to actually do it because I promise you they are well worth it. First is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This is the first volume in a series of graphic memoirs from a woman who grew up during the Iranian Revolution. It's her experience growing up in Iran. It's her experience of going away to Europe for school and what that was like when it was such a different environment and situation. These are all fantastic. I think there's 3 volumes. I've read all of them and would highly recommend them. The next one you should definitely read if you haven't already is March by John Lewis. John Lewis sadly passed away last year in 2020, but he was a US congressman for many, many years and was a big part of the civil rights movement. I love the fact that he's used graphic novels to tell his story. So this is the first of a trilogy about his early life and experiences being part of the civil rights movement. There are also later books as well about the later parts of his life. I actually need to continue on with the series, but I have read this one and it was fantastic. I would definitely recommend it. My final nonfiction recommendation for you is The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui, and this was actually a winner of the American Book Award, which is really cool, and it's well deserved. This is a graphic memoir about a family's flight from Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The author was a very young child when all of this happened, and so part of this is her digging into the trauma of her family history and what her parents went through and what happened, and also how that influenced the way that she was raised in the United States, and asking questions about what she then is now passing on to her own children. So yeah, this was incredible, so powerful. She also did all of the illustrations herself, and I think they're beautiful. If you haven't checked it out, I would definitely recommend it. My last category of recommendations for you is going to include sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. And again, some of the things that I'm recommending here are BookTube favorites. They're things that you've probably seen other people talking about, and honestly with good reason, because they're very good and they're very accessible, which, especially if you're new to graphic novels and you're wanting to dip your toes in, some of these might be great options depending on what your genre preferences are. Of course, I can't not recommend Saga. This series is so good. It's kind of a blend of science fiction and fantasy. It's got amazing characters, really interesting, if sometimes weird, world building, and it begins with this sort of Romeo and Juliet style romance that results in a baby that people think shouldn't exist, and her parents' efforts to survive and keep her alive, and it's really, really good. There are moments that break your heart, there's weird stuff that happens. FYI, there is like some brutal violence in here, and there is some explicit content as well, so kind of know that going in. There's a reason I have my like adult recommendation category separately, but I just think this graphic novel series is amazing. I think so far there's 9 issues out and I'm up to date. I've read all of them. I'm really excited to get more, and if you haven't read them yet, you should definitely check it out. I also know people have been talking about this on BookTube recently. Like, I want to say Ashley just did a reread of all of these and discussion, so you know, they're weird, but they're really good. And I'm gonna say that in general, Brian K. Vaughan is pretty great. He's a really good writer. So one other series by him I want to recommend that they have just recently started adapting for a television show, Why the Last Man. These are really good and really interesting. There are a handful of things that maybe don't age as well, and from what I've seen, I think the show is doing a better job of adapting some of those things, and he's been working with them as well. But this series is so interesting and so compelling. It's basically a dystopian series where one day every animal and person with a Y chromosome dies, like instantaneously, except for this one young man and his pet monkey. It's really interesting because it explores what would it be like if suddenly there were no men and it was all women. And, you know, there's been some argument that, oh, it would be like a utopia, But is that really true, and what is human nature? And I think this explores a lot of those ideas in really interesting and compelling ways. So if you haven't read the series, you can read it, you can watch the show. I just think they're very, very good. My next recommendation is a graphic novel series that is based on a podcast. I have not really listened to the podcast very much, although I know it's very popular, but I did read the first graphic novel and I thought it was very funny. So if you're into Dungeons and Dragons, you might try The Adventure Zone. And if you're into D&D, you may already know of this podcast with this family that plays D&D together, but they've taken some of their adventures and turned them into graphic novels. So this first one is Here There Be Gerblins. I thought it was hilarious. It doesn't seem to be hitting so much for everyone. It seems like some of the people who are really big fans of the podcast don't enjoy the graphic novels as much, but I thought it was fun. It made me laugh, so maybe give it a try. Then if you are the kind of fantasy reader who is really into good world building and you don't necessarily need things to be fast paced or make sense right away, you should definitely try reading Monstrous by Marjorie Liu. I have this bind up of the first few volumes, and also guys, the art in this is stunning. It's got really in-depth world building, and it's really interesting because it's almost like if Lovecraftian monsters and Art Deco and manga had a baby. I don't know if that's weird, but this is so good. The world building is so interesting. I just think the series is fantastic. It does get quite dark. It's got a lot of violence, and you know, I mean, any of the stuff in the adult category here may have some of that, but I would check it out. I think they're great. And there's a reason they're so popular. My final recommendation for you today is for if you're looking for horror written by queer women of color that is centering queer women of color, you should check out The Low Low Woods by Carmen Maria Machado. I really loved this, and it's interesting to me. I know I said this when I initially reviewed it, but I just find it so fascinating because looking at the Goodreads reviews after I wrote my raving 5-star review, there was a very, very clear split between mostly women giving it 4 and 5 stars and being like, this was great, I loved it, it was creepy, it was really good, and mostly men giving it like 1 or 2 stars and being like, what was this? It wasn't scary, I didn't like it. And it's interesting to me because it's not written for a male audience. It is written by and centers queer women of color, and it's really a story that is scary for women. So it's just fascinating to me that there are so many men who are like, this isn't horror, and I'm like, oh, but it is. Anyway, check out content warnings for this if you need them, but I loved this. I thought it was very disturbing, but really, really good and powerful, and I just love Carmen Maria Machado. All of her writing is great. So hopefully that gives you some options to get you started reading graphic novels. I just think they're so much fun. They're quick to read, and you know, it's the end of the year, so what better time to start getting to some of those graphic novels? And if you're trying to hit some reading goals, these are a good option. And you know, I also gave you lots of things to diversify your shelves. Speaking of which, if you want to further diversify your shelves, don't forget to click the link in the video description down below to go check out the Kickstarter for Olaju: The Edge of Origins. I am really excited to see this graphic novel come to life, and I hope you guys will go and check out the project, support it if it looks of interest to you, and yeah, let's read some graphic novels, diversify our shelves, and have some fun. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on anything I talked about in this video. And for your question of the day, recommend to me one of your favorite graphic novels. What is one of your go-to recommendations? If you have a friend who's like, yeah, I want to check out graphic novels, I want to get into it. If you have a recommendation, leave it in the video description down below. If you guys like this video, it really helps if you give it a thumbs up, and subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.